I would like to, on behalf of Adalah Justice Project, we're grateful to gather with everybody for this conversation. We are honored to be joined by leaders from Christians for a Free Palestine, and we want to sincerely thank Jewish Voice for Peace for hosting this important conversation with us and for their partnership in building movements rooted in justice. So before we begin, I wanted to give just a few opening remarks and really name the gravity of this moment that we find ourselves in. As the genocide in Gaza continues, even under the guise of a so-called ceasefire and a manufactured board of peace, Israel continues to violate that ceasefire, killing Palestinians while families remain displaced, living in tents in the dead of winter, facing starvation, and cut off from the urgently needed humanitarian aid that is still being blocked from entering by Israel. At the same time, conditions in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, are rapidly escalating, and intensified annexation, expanding settlements, and increasing settler violence that are attacking Palestinians on a daily basis, including prominent Palestinian villages and towns. Across Christian communities and beyond, this has created a deep moral rupture. Long-held beliefs and institutional silences are being tested in real time, forcing urgent questions about complicity, power, and the role faith plays when violence and dispossessions are justified in its name. Christian Zionism has played a central role in shaping how many Christian institutions understand Israel and Palestine. It is often framed as a theology or biblical interpretation, but in practice, it has functioned as a political project deeply tied to empire, militarism, and state power. Naming that reality is not about shaming individuals who were brought up under this theology. It is about understanding how belief systems are organized and mobilized to sustain ongoing harm. We are also witnessing right now, in real time, fractures on the political right, including a growing divide between, traditional Christian Zionists and so-called America First Christian nationalists. While these factions may be in conflict with one another, playing out, on Twitter or on podcasts, neither of them offer a framework rooted in justice, dignity, or collective liberation. And for those committed to progressive values, this moment calls for discernment, not alignment. It requires rejecting all ideologies that rely on exclusion, supremacy, and dehumanization, rather than choosing between the competing forms of them. And so that political landscape helps us explain what we're seeing now. We're seeing figures like Mike Huckabee, who is the U.S. ambassador to Israel, alongside coordinated campaigns that have sent more than 1,000 U.S. pastors to Israel back in December. And it's a part of a campaign with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and evangelical organizations like Friends of Zion, which are showing how Christian Zionism continues to be mobilized as a global political project aimed at shaping churches in the U.S., Latin America, and Europe. All of this is unfolding as Palestinian lives are being erased in Gaza, and as Palestinian Christians are routinely denied visibility by a theology that claims to speak in the name of Christianity, while ignoring their existence, their history, and the realities they are living through right now. It is important to be clear that Israel has long relied on Christian Zionist networks to act as political foot soldiers, shaping political opinion, mobilizing churches, and providing theological cover for occupation, annexation, and genocide. But it is just as important to recognize that the strategy is not uncontested. More and more people are turning away from Christian Zionism, and that shift matters. And what even matters more is what people are turning toward. This moment calls for strengthening liberatory faith traditions that reject both Zionism and nationalism, and instead root in faith, justice, and solidarity. Leaders like Reverend Munder Isaac in Bethlehem remind us that Christianity does not belong to empire and cannot be used to sanctify domination. Liberation theology insists that faith must side with life, that neutrality is in the face of oppression is never neutral. And so that is the political and moral framework before us, not only opposing harmful theology, but actively building and amplifying traditions that move people toward accountability, courage, and collective liberation. And that is the spirit of tonight's conversation, and that is why I'm so honored and grateful to be introducing to you all leaders from within Christians for a Free Palestine who really believe in this. And we hope this conversation marks the beginning of an ongoing series examining the revival of Christian Zionism and the organizing work pushing back against it. So thank you all for being here. And now I would like to introduce to you our incredible panelists. Our first panelist is Jonathan Brenneman. Jonathan Brenneman is a Palestinian American Christian and member of the national leadership team of Christians for a Free Palestine. He is a graduate of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and has worked in multiple countries doing Palestine advocacy, human rights monitoring, and grassroots organizing and challenging anti-Arab racism. Jonathan's work connects the Palestinian decolonial struggle with those of other indigenous peoples and challenges theologies of domination. And with Jonathan, Reverend Dr. Crystal Silva McCormick. Reverend Dr. Silva McCormick is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and a member of the national leadership of the Christians for Free Palestine. Her work has largely focused on Muslim-Christian relations, specifically in Latin America, as well as current expressions of Christian Zionism. Born and raised in El Paso, Texas, her family immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico, and it is their stories, along with being raised on the border, that have shaped her spiritual and personal identity as a scholar and minister. And last but not least, Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart. A Black queer daughter of Detroit, Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart is a minister, professor, and movement strategist. She is a strategic partnerships director at the Political Research Associates, a social justice research and strategy center, and teaches theology and religious studies at Villanova University, Arcadia University, and Eastern University's prison education program. As a religion and public life fellow at Harvard Divinity School, she taught graduate students on topics related to religious literacy and government. So I'm so happy to be joined here with you all. And let's get started with the questions. I'm gonna start with you, Jonathan. We'll just start in the order that I asked or I introduced you all. But the opening question for all of you is: each of you comes from a distinct faith tradition shaped by Christian Zionism in one way or another. When did you begin to sense a tension between what you were being taught about the Holy Land and what your faith tradition calls you toward in terms of justice, dignity, and love of neighbor? Can you share more about your own journey? Jonathan?
Thanks. Thanks, Izzy, and thanks to the over 300 people who came here who are interested in this subject. For me, on my father's side, I come from a long line of Mennonites, and Mennonites have had a long tradition of challenging Christian nationalism. It's a pacifist tradition and one that believed very strongly in the separation of church and state. And then on my mother's side, being Palestinian Christian, also a strong rejection of Christian Zionism as people who are followers of Jesus living in the land of Palestine who are often erased by Christian Zionists. And so, you know, early on, I always knew that Christian Zionism was wrong. And yet, growing up as a part Palestinian in a rural town in Ohio and a pacifist after September 11th, um, I was surrounded by Christian nationalism, which is very closely tied to Christian Zionism. Every Christian Zionist I've ever met is also a Christian nationalist. And so for me, I remember like at times as a kid being like, I'm pretty sure I'm a heretic. because I don't believe all of these things that these other Christians are saying about Israel. And then, went to college, studied scripture, found other Christian traditions besides the Christian nationalism that I was surrounded by, connected more with Palestinian liberation theologians and liberation theologians from all over, and recognized that um, so many people around me growing up had been indoctrinated. And my family particularly has been a large part of some of the Palestinian Christian movements that have challenged Christian Zionism internationally through the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference and others. And I tried to carry on that work in a different way in my participation in Christians for a Free Palestine.
Thank you, Jonathan. How about you, Reverend Crystal?
Hi, yeah, thank you for having us and for everyone that is joining us for this conversation. I would say that um, because Christian Zionism shows up in different traditions, whether they be progressive, whether they be Protestant or Catholic, and I have been part of all of those traditions. My grandmother wanted to raise me Catholic, my mom raised me Protestant, and I spent a lot of time in evangelical and fundamentalist spaces as an evangelical and fundamentalist, and then as a progressive Christian. And in each part of those journeys or that journey in Christianity, I was given different understandings of Christian Zionism, different expressions, I guess I would say. And I think what challenged it and really introduced me to Palestine was reading Edward Said. And I would say that seeing the wall in Bethlehem as somebody who was born and raised in El Paso, seeing the wall as I was growing up and going across the border to see family, to go to Mexico. Um, I think through my childhood, I didn't understand what the wall and the checkpoints were. They became sort of ubiquitous, normal. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I began to understand and to question what those things were and why they existed and that they weren't normal. So then when I went to Palestine and I saw the wall, I knew that even though they weren't the same, that they had the same roots, that they were born from the same or similar systems. And so I long very much for the communities that I come from to understand those similarities. But I would say that what was pivotal for me is reading Edward Said. And then what followed then was listening to the voices of Palestinian Christians that are more contemporary. And then seeing that wall was just did more than what books could do for me. Seeing the wall and understanding the wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Reverend Naomi.
Thanks everybody. I'm so happy to be here with friends and comrades. For me, it was being there. It was being in Palestine. So I too grew up in um, I'm not sure if it would quite be defined as fundamentalist or evangelical. I mean, if we get kind of scholarly about these terms, these categories do matter. I will say that I grew up in um, a conservative, Black, historically Black Christian tradition. Um, and the the Christian Zionism piece was made explicit more so in my school. So I went to a private Christian, Black Christian academy from kindergarten through eighth grade. And there is when I learned that we, unequivocally support Israel. Where I first heard Genesis, sort of lobbed as justification for supporting the nation state of Israel. But I will say that part of what I think is so sinister about Christian Zionism and its theology is its ability to hide behind some of the more acknowledged, celebrated, talked about tenets of Christian theology. It sort of slides in there as if it is a foregone conclusion, as if it's a natural conclusion for the Bible, for Christianity in general. And so I didn't know I was being formed as a Christian Zionist. Nobody used that terminology, but I do remember yearly trips to the Holy Land, right? Advertised from the pulpit in my church. And looking back now, I know that the itinerary of those trips was designed to reinforce Christian Zionist kind of propaganda. Fast forward to seminary. So here I am now trying to get prepared to spiritually accompany a Christian congregation. And the gift of my seminary was that we had to do cross-cultural experiences in order to graduate. And the year I was up to do my cross-cultural experience was the year our seminary was taking a group of students to Israel, Palestine. And my seminary made the deliberate decision to have a course preceding the travel about Palestine, taught by someone who is part of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. So we read Said, we, thought about empire-friendly Christianity and how that Christianity, when it takes root, leads to kind of morally justified occupation, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a semester of a course taught by this person, right? And then we went. And it was clear to me that by going and hearing the testimonies of Palestinians, Palestinian Christians, and Palestinians who were not Christian, that my entire theological worldview needed to change, right? Not just regarding Palestine, not just regarding Christian Zionism. Palestine for me was thoroughly transformational in that it invited me to re-examine all of my theological claims. So for me, I feel I regret that it took so long, but I am very, very grateful to have had the experience of Palestinians inviting me, calling me, compelling me to take a second look. And so that put me on this path, and that was now 12 years ago.
Wow. Well, thank you all for really sharing. I mean, it's very clear. This is something I hear constantly. Like when I bring people to Palestine as well, is just the deep connections of our communities, and how oppression functions, and the tethers that bring it all together, and just the visceral experience. And I wanted to go on, and I wanted to continue with you, Naomi, because Christian Zionism, it's a word that's talked about a lot, especially now. We see it talked about more in the media, on social media, especially as we have, U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, being he identifies as a proud Christian Zionist. We have a lot of people in big tech as well who identify as proud Christian Zionists. And so, it's Christian Zionism is often presented as a matter of theology, but we also know it to function as political ideology that's tied to power and empire and power, like I mentioned in my opening remarks. But how have you seen Christian Zionism operate inside faith communities as something that shapes political loyalty rather than spiritual formation? And I was also wondering, could you possibly define it as well, what Christian Zionism is?
Sure. And I'm eager to also have my friends Jonathan and Crystal jump in to flesh out kind of the frame, because I do think that this defining frame is important. So I'm going to read a bit from a resource that Political Research Associates, where I work, that my colleagues at PRA have designed, Christian Zionism 101. I'm happy to also share the link to that. So folks, it's available for download in a PDF if you go to politicalresearch.org. But so that's where I'm taking some of this language. So if I got to define it in a pithy kind of way, I might say that Christian Zionism refers to movements that promote and endorse Jewish nationalism, usually through a Jewish state, based on a certain kind of reading and interpretation of the Christian Bible. It ignores or rejects Palestinian claims to land. It deploys overtly anti-Muslim rhetoric and action. It fetishizes Jews, or as our friend Rabbi Alyssa Wise likes to say, fetishizes or instrumentalizes Jews. This is a concept known as philo-Semitism, right? That the solidarity, and I put that in quotes, the solidarity between Christian Zionists and Jews extends so far as Jews are what I like to call a plot device in the eschatological dreams of Christian Zionists. And so the relationship is fragile, only tethered together by an eschatological vision that ultimately calls for the conversion of Jews to Christianity, or death. So the end of the theological story requires Jews to be destroyed or to convert to Christianity. So I appreciate, Izzy, how you were saying, you were naming it rightly as a political worldview that is dipped in a certain kind of Christian theology, namely theology about how the world will end and what will catalyze what Christian nationalists, Christian Zionists will call the rapture, the second coming of Jesus. And so that's way too short a definition for these complicated theological and political ideas, but that gets us started, right? It masquerades as a kind of religious solidarity, but in fact, it is a theology that requires the suffering and demise of Jewish folks. I'm looking at my colleagues to see if y'all want to kind of flesh that out a bit.
I don't know, Jonathan, Crystal, do y'all, who would like to hop on? I saw a lot of nods from Crystal, so maybe Crystal, do you have anything to add?
I was making sure Jonathan wasn't ready to chime in. Are you okay? How do you feel? I mean, I appreciate everything that Reverend Naomi brought. I think that it is complex. I have seen scholars argue over this definition, but I think that also it becomes very complex because it has so many different iterations, right? So you have some Christian Zionists who maybe don't believe in the rapture, let's say, right? But I think that maybe finding some common threads is really important. And I think Jewish exceptionalism is one really important common thread, because I think there is an exceptionalizing of Jews that is at the same time, which Reverend Naomi named, which is objectifying Jews, right? Jews are reduced to an object in someone else's theology, and they are not human beings. They're not human beings to be cared for because they are human beings. They are an object in a story. They are an object to bring Jesus back. They are an object in someone's theological imagination. And so it is ultimately anti-Semitic, actually, right? To not care about your neighbor because they are your neighbor, but instead to have the philosemitism, the exceptionalizing, the obsession, the fixation with them because you believe that you're going to be rewarded in some way for treating them specially. And another thread, and a lot of Christian Zionists don't know that this is the case, but I think is that it necessitates the displacement and the erasure of Palestinians. Right. And so I don't think all Christian Zionists identify as Christian Zionists. As Reverend Naomi said, that's very important because you might have a pastor like John Hagee, and he knows what he's up to politically. He's meeting with leaders and in Israel, in the U.S., and there are Latino leaders that are doing this as well. And then there are the members of their churches who believe that they are doing something that is faithful and they don't have a reward financially or otherwise politically, right? So there's just so many different motivations that we have to look at, I think. But looking at common threads, I think the exceptionalizing of Jews, um, who are objects in these narratives and theologies. And then the other one is the erasure and the displacement of Palestinians, which is necessary for this belief system, be it theological, political, or both. I think are important to name. And I think sometimes some scholars want to say this is only, you have to say it's the political application is important. And I think it's important, but I think that these organizations would not be after so many minoritized communities if what they believed wasn't important, just as important as the political application. So I wanted to add that because people's ideas of what it is to be faithful to God is just as important as where they send their money, what they're doing at the ballot box, etc. And so I appreciate everything Naomi said, and I would just really emphasize that those common threads that come along, and a literalist belief in scripture that often hinges on that Genesis. If you bless Israel, God will bless you, right? So making the modern state synonymous with biblical Israel is another common thread. But I think just looking for those common threads in what people say is really important when looking at what Christian Zionism is. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, just to hop right onto what Crystal was saying, that phrase of like God will bless you if you bless them, we've seen evangelists and missionaries use as they, especially rich white ones, going into poor communities in the U.S. and around the world and saying, "You will be blessed if you bless the nation state of Israel through my ministry." And then they take some of the money and they give some of the money to Israel, and they are impoverishing these communities even more while claiming they're going to make them rich. Um, and so it's like a really exploitative scheme as well. And the one thing that I would add on like the political end is that historically Christian Zionism has helped to perpetuate Christian nationalism in the US. Right? You have early fundamentalist pastors teaching this kind of new theology at the time that said that you could use the Bible as a fortune-telling device. You don't have to worry about all of the like moral stuff in there. Focus on it. If you read it a certain way, you can tell the future and you can benefit from that. And when Israel's created in 48, and especially when Israel occupies Jerusalem in 1967, the Christian Zionists were able to say, we were right. We said that there was going to be Jewish rule over Jerusalem. We were right about that. So also believe us about interracial marriage being a sin. Believe us about women's liberation being evil. Believe us that queer people are sinful. And they were able to use this to perpetuate a broader super right wing politics as well. So it's that mixture of belief and politics, historically and continuing today. And even as the like future telling aspects maybe aren't being promoted as much, Now it's that like health and wealth stuff that is being promoted more to continue to perpetuate Christian Zionism and to use it to push a right-wing political agenda.
No, it's such a great point, and all of you touched up on very important aspects of this, and it makes me think as well, like something that has been very prominent, I think, in during the course of this genocide, is that there has been really of a rallying or energizing of particularly brown and black Christian Zionists communities and congregations. And so, I wanted to ask, both Naomi and Crystal, you both, grew up in similar communities, and particularly, how it relates to this political framework of, like, the right, how to, it's in a lot of ways it's confusing, right? It's like, on one hand, right wing agenda is very anti-black, anti-immigrant, but yet, they're using communities to further their Christian Zionist agenda. So, I'm curious, like, how does this happen? Many brown and black Christian communities are rooted in liberation and survival historically, and how do you make sense of Christian Zionism taking hold in the communities that have been shaped by oppression? So I want to start with you, Naomi.
Sure, yeah. So there's a scholar named Roger Bauman, who has done some extraordinary research trying to get to the bottom of this very question, right? Particularly in Black Christian spaces. What is this hold that the Christian Zionist movement seems to have in Black Christian spaces? And, he talks about a couple of things. One is the invocation of debt. What I mean by that is Rabbi Heschel marched with King. Jewish folks were in solidarity with Black folk during the civil rights movement. And so don't we owe it to Jewish folks today? Now, by Jewish folks today, they mean Israel. The same solidarity, the same commitment, the same investment, right? So again, I keep calling this sinister and diabolical because I believe it is, right? It is the almost like sticking your finger in the wound in order to compel the person who has been wounded to make a decision, regardless of the fact that sticking your finger in a wound that has not healed hurts. Yeah. So the exploitation of Black solidarity, Black commitment to a kind of multiracial front is I think at the core of some of this exploitation of Black piety. Right? We want to please God. You told us that the Bible says this is what we got to do to be blessed, and so I am just trying. And of course, if this is going to be preached in an institution where I am, the leader of the institution is not calling forward a critical analysis of the text, not calling forth questions about the context of the text. Who's talking to whom? Who wrote this? What are we talking about here? Right? So at the same time, you need a sort of, I'm going to use this word, authoritarian little a culture to facilitate there was a question around, are people just without reservation and hesitation following leaders like John Hagee? Well, you set up the institution so that it perpetuates the conditions for this kind of propagandizing. Right? You already have folk not asking questions about how we interpret that scripture and that scripture and that scripture, right? So all of these conditions have to be there. And Christian Zionism then is easily slid in. So I also think there's a deracializing of the conversation. that happens. When you say an organization like CUFI is trying to appeal to Black faith communities, Black Christian communities, you don't want the Black folk. I went to Palestine and immediately, I said, oh, these technologies I recognize. These tools of oppression, apartheid, occupation, I recognize as a Black person from the United States. So if you can remove race and a racial analysis from this, right? Even more so, if you can associate oppression with Jews and not with Palestinians, right? And say, don't you want to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed like you, right? It's a very sinister, diabolical way of narrating relationship that captures people's imagination, as Crystal was saying, every time.
Thank you. Reverend Crystal.
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate what my colleagues have shared here and the parallels it has with the Latina community, and particularly what Jonathan named about the relationship between Christian nationalism. Because what you see both in Latin America and the US is this idea that the US is exceptional. And this is a thread that cannot be pulled, cannot be taken out from Christian Zionism for Latina communities. Right. And we're seeing that right now when you see so many people, including a congresswoman I just saw this weekend who was in tears on an Instagram reel, pleading for her son who's been in a detention center for 18 days. And she said, he's in horrible conditions and he's doing everything the right way. But she was an adamant Trump supporter and she was anti-immigrant as an immigrant herself. And so these are the incongruities that you see all the time within Latina communities, Christian and not, but especially Christian communities, where you think, okay, you come from a minoritized community, and particularly in the US, what is happening? And so I think there's definitely proximity to power, absolutely. This idea that if I can get close to whiteness, this idea that, white people are better, superior, if I can get close to that. So there's definitely that. There is, as Reverend Naomi named, this exploitation of people's ideas of what faithfulness is. And organizations like CUFI, the Philos Project, the National Hispanic Leadership Conference, run by Samuel Rodriguez, which is not only Christian Zionists, they do other things, but support for Israel is one of their big things. They started intentional outreach to the Latina community at the same time that white evangelicalism was on the decline in 2014. So they also know what they're doing. This is no coincidence, right? And so white evangelicalism goes down, their voting power was going down, and they did intentional outreach, not just to Latina communities, but to Catholic and to Black communities. So this is an intentional strategy. And we also have to be mindful, again, of the different motivations of people, right? You have people in congregations who are looking to their leaders to teach them what it means to be faithful. And they're telling them that blowing people up is. And they should know better. We all should know better. But this is what they're hearing. And their leaders get paid by all these organizations to take people to Israel, right? To go to Israel and to do these propaganda trips. So there's all of this going on now. But in the background, what I think that people need to understand is that proximity to power is important, especially for immigrant communities and those of us who come from families that are our parents and grandparents were immigrants. Always this proximity to power. And this history in Latin America, where, as Jonathan named, Christian missionaries went and they spread Cold War propaganda across Latin America that was synonymous with what the US wanted, right? Its interests to supposedly fight communism and that the US is exceptional. And all of this was packaged within evangelical Christianity that was spread all over Latin America. So whenever people that come from these communities often hear about support for Palestine or I don't know, other ideas that they associate with communism, they immediately become suspicious. So it was also part of US propaganda packaged as Christianity, and it has taken root, deep root, and all of that has become synonymous with support for Israel. And it has, to undo this means to undo a lot, as Reverend Naomi also named earlier. It's not just Palestine, it has to undo a lot for people, right? It requires us to undo a lot of our belief systems that have been prepackaged to believe that the US is exceptional and that this is what it means to be a good Christian, to believe these things about the US and about Israel, about the modern state, and not to question the violence that they yield against Latina communities or against Palestinians because it's biblical, because it's right, because the US is chosen. So all of these have been packaged, but for decades. It's not new. But these communities like CUFI or these organizations are exploiting them. And then the one other piece I would name is that they're also telling Latina communities that we come from Sephardic Judaism. So they will say, hey, do you want to tap into your roots? You need to look. You come from Sephardic Judaism, and that's how you're going to tap in. And then the most recent turn as well is to say that we're going to fight anti-Semitism in Latina communities and of course invoke the Genesis 12:3 to be blessed by God or cursed if we don't. So I think that's kind of the package deal that is being sold. And unfortunately, you have a lot of people in the Latina community who want proximity to power, like this congresswoman whose son is now in a detention center, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, and all of the communities are being targeted in different ways. And as you mentioned, Crystal, we are seeing this revivalism also of anti-communist propaganda, especially around Venezuela, Cuba, and it's very much tied into as well of the Israel's project as well. Like we're seeing this conversation happen a lot on mainstream media, particularly far right mainstream media. But it's interesting to see this revival, and I wanted to in the U.S. There is, you all are doing incredible work to resist all of this indoctrination that is happening. But there's also a lot of work happening in Palestine. And Jonathan, I've known you for a while. I know that you've been a very important and critical organizer around the Palestinian Christian sphere. And I know that you recently came back from, you and a few other Christians for a Free Palestine leaders have came back recently from a trip to Palestine where you attended the Kairos conference. And so I wanted to ask you, particularly as a Palestinian Christian, how does Christian Zionism affect Palestinian Christian communities, in Palestine, both, spiritually and communally, and also as well politically? And yeah, how do you see them resisting right now, especially?
Yeah, thanks for that question because Christian Zionism has no place for Palestinian Christians. Right? We do not fit into this idea that God wants a Jewish supremacist state in Palestine as the people who have been stewarding this tradition since it began. I think part of the work that a lot of us are doing is in recognition that Christianity has for a long time been the most violent, colonial, racist religion in the world. And one of the things that Palestinian liberation theology does is it asks, like, can Christianity be an indigenous wisdom tradition again? Can we reclaim it from the Crusaders that came and hurt the Christian population along with the Jewish and Muslim population? Can we reclaim it from the colonial Christians that came from Europe back to Palestine and told us we were practicing our indigenous tradition wrong? And can we do that in such a way that liberates all of the others that have been harmed by people in North America? And so one of the most recent examples of this is the Kairos document. So as I said, Christians from Christian denominations from Europe and all over the world have come back to Palestine. And so they don't always get along very well, as they have their competing truth claims. But representatives of all of those denominations, as who were Palestinian, came together and said, in one voice, we want liberation and we want freedom. And they wrote this up in what's called the Kairos Palestine document. And they just published an update to that, the Kairos Palestine 2 document, which is uh, they had a conference to launch that document. And that's why most of the leadership of Christians for a Free Palestine were able to go and participate in that as a response to say, how are people in the U.S., how are Christians in the U.S. going to respond to this call for costly solidarity? And so I highly recommend everyone just reading that document. It is powerful. They do not equivocate, calling what Israel is doing a genocide, calling Israel an apartheid state, speaking words of support to their fellow Palestinians, and calling on Christians in the global South for solidarity, and calling on Christians, particularly in the U.S. and Europe, to cut ties with Zionism entirely. And so we'll put in the chat the link for that Kairos 2 document, and highly recommend that you read it. And really, that is shaping a lot of how Christians for a Free Palestine is focusing our work as a response to the Kairos document.
Thank you, Jonathan. And there's so much to talk about. I know that there's not a lot of time. There are a lot of questions. People are asking so many questions in the chat, so we want to get to that. But I wanted, this webinar, we're hoping to continue these webinar series to really go deep dive into topics. But a main purpose of this webinar is really to amplify and show the incredible work of Christians for a Free Palestine and the movement that you all are building in this ecosystem of radical politics and folks who really believe in collective liberation. So I wanted to ask you all about that. So you all emerged, really, I would say, within the past 3 years during the genocide of Gaza, and there is an important value of having Christian voices really be at the forefront of what's going on, especially within the context of U.S. empire and using Christianity to further their political means. But why did for I'm gonna start maybe this time with Crystal and then move to each of you. But why did this organization feel necessary in this moment, and how does it understand its role within Christian traditions and movements for justice, including what are concrete ways? So like, how do people? I guess it's a two-part question. Why is it necessary? And what are concrete ways that people and faith communities can move from moral clarity to collective action? So this is more of like the call to actions that you all may have.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, Jonathan co-founded this organization, and has been doing this work for a long time. So I'm just privileged to come along with this team and do this work. But I think definitely we've decided collectively that the need is there because people said the need was there. There are a lot of Christians that have not been part of churches because they see churches not actively speaking or doing the work of justice, right? They're not naming wrongs and evil in the world, and they're not taking action against it, and certainly not, to quote Munther Isaac, doing anything that requires cost. Right? And that goes for all of us. I don't exclude myself. Churches have been inactive. They have been very active in harming people, right? They've been very active in harming people. So a lot of people have left churches and didn't have a space to identify. But when they started to see what Christians for a Free Palestine was doing, they became really invigorated and said, well, that's important to me. That's a way that I can live my faith. And they became really active and activated by what Christians for a Free Palestine was doing because it is rooted in the Christian tradition. It is rooted in the Gospels, in the gospel that is rooted in justice for those on the margins. And so I think it activated a lot of people that have been disillusioned and harmed by church and who've walked away, or who have been barely hanging on. And so I think that that's something we've heard over and over. And I think that churches can get move from just, caring, which a lot of Christians do. They care and they want to know, how can we get involved? And there's so many ways. Not everybody can get arrested, but that's not the ask, right? So there are many ways that people can get involved. They can get involved in CFP. They can get educated. They can educate other people. And CFP has so many spaces for people to do nonviolent direct action, but also to do to provide resources for them to reach out to politicians, to leaders, to boycott things like Boycott Chevron, to provide resources for churches. CFP has done all of these things. And so there is something for everyone to find a way to get plugged in and take action. So I want to give my colleagues room to say more and things that I haven't thought of and seen or said, but there are definitely ways everyone can get plugged in and meet the moment, because I know there are a lot of people who really care and want to find ways to get plugged in.
Thank you, Crystal. Jonathan, Naomi, do y'all have more to add?
Um, I'm going to say no, because I know we got more to do. No.
I will add one thing because it also somewhat answers one of the questions that was in the chat, and that is that especially. So I've been organizing in denominations and churches for a long time, and churches were, and denominations particularly, were at the forefront of divestment in the U.S. More church denominations have passed divestment resolutions or at least put investment screens on companies that are complicit in Israeli occupation than really in any other sector. And so I definitely want to give some props to all of the organizers that have done that. And something that we noticed was that after October 7th, all of those structures were created to do internal work. And a lot of the Christian organizing was kind of siloed and internal. And so there was also this push, the story is that like this was started by a bunch. We know that the Christian Zionists are over there promoting this genocide, but where are the Christians that are speaking out against it? And so we really wanted to mobilize people to be more public and to be more in the streets. So we have gone to Christians United for Israel or CUFI's lobby summit days and disrupted what they're doing and blocked their buses and interrupted their speakers with song. We have gone to have been building a base through our community calls, through our Solidarity Circle small groups, because something that I'm not sure we expected was that we also became church for a lot of people who had been disillusioned and who had been marginalized by Christian nationalist churches. And so we are also building that up as well. So just invite everyone here. If you're curious, if you're interested, please join us.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you all. I mean, I'm just going to +1. Definitely go to Christians for a Free Palestine website, follow them on Instagram, and plug into, what they're doing. I think that this movement is very, critical right now. And I'm speaking as a veteran Palestinian activist in the U.S. I'm so impressed by the work that you all are doing and also just the framework that you're coming in with. I think we need more moral clarity especially in this moment of just such darkness. We need more light, and so I know that you all provide that. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A. We have a lot of interesting questions from our audience, and I'm going to start with the question for Reverend Naomi. So this person asks, how important is the aspect of prophecy in the threads connecting black churches in the U.S. and Christian Zionism or philo-Semitism in thinking of structures in the church that centers prophets?
This is a great question. I first want to point back to, I don't know if it was Jonathan or Crystal who said that um, the belief that the Bible is a fortune-telling text, or that the Bible is a history book, like that we can read it from cover to cover and it's chronological in its organization, right? Like there are some, again, I think conditions, there are some assumptions that one has to bring to the Bible and to Christianity in order for Christian Zionism to take root. So I do think that a preoccupation with the afterlife and the end times, right? Now, again, this is not the conversation where we want to, or maybe it is, examine these big categories of Christian theology like eschatology. How do people tell the story of the end times, the end of the world, right? And what does the story they're telling about how the world ends compel them to do in the here and now? Yeah. So I think it's not a coincidence that the prioritization of end times storytelling, of prosperity gospel, Jonathan mentioned it, the health and wellness, the health and right. It's not a coincidence that those theologies are ones that get prioritized in Christian Zionist communities, right? You need people to the point of obsession, be concerned about, when is Jesus coming back? Do I know that I'm going to be caught up in the rapture, right? These are fundamental questions. And it doesn't matter then that the answer to those questions requires somebody else's suffering and death. If you can get somebody to be so afraid, anxious, obsessed about, where are you going to go when you die, which is often a question I heard growing up in Christian communities, then they will tolerate and ignore a lot to secure their own salvation, right? So yes, I think it's partly due to kind of certain interpretations of the prophetic, certain interpretations of the apocalypse, of the book of Revelation, for example, certain interpretations of what Hebrew Bible writers were talking about doing, right? And so yes, I do think that what Christian Zionism, the institution, depends on, right, are those conditions to be set. They're not coming to, my church. They're not coming to Crystal's to try to, because those seeds will not take root, right? Because all of the other stuff, somebody asked a question about the relationship between Christian Zionism and patriarchy, right? Yeah, let's connect these dots, right? They depend on each other. They depend on each other. This is why I call my transformation via Palestine thorough, because I got to let go of the patriarchy. I got to let go of the homophobia and transphobia. I got to let go of the, right? If I'm going to holler free Palestine with some integrity, right? So I guess I just want to affirm the question, where the question is coming from. And part of what we need to do is investigate the theological roots that manifest as Christian Zionism politically. That's an important work that I think Christians for Free Palestine is doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and I wanted to also see from there are a lot of questions around uh, Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism. I'm having a hard time pulling up the questions, so I'm sorry. I'm like, ooh, where did it go? Little technical difficulty. Oh, here we go. Okay. So this one, I wanted to ask this question to Jonathan, and actually, this person asked this question, but I think Jonathan, you touched upon this a little bit at the beginning, but this person asked, Christianity, especially that espoused by white supremacist colonizer countries, was used to subjugate and have indigenous populations submit to colonization to this day. Palestine is clearly a settler colonial issue. How can we trust that the institutions designed to subjugate people will be reliable allies in undoing the current systemic issues? Why should we believe that this iteration of Christianity is a friend rather than a different wolf in sheep's clothing?
Yeah, I absolutely love that question and appreciate the skepticism. It is well deserved, right? I will say that in Christianity, as in every tradition, there are threads that are exclusionary and exclusive and supremacist, and there are threads that challenge that and that are liberatory and that are universalist. And so, um, you know, what we are trying at Christians for a Free Palestine as a like queer and POC led organization, as an organization that um, is unequivocally in support of those that have been marked that ethos all the way through our work. And we try to do this specifically to name and challenge the harms that Christianity has caused in Palestine and all over the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And I have this question that this is also another thing that keeps on coming up around the question of Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. So I wanted to put this question to you, Crystal, which is churches seem to be more willing to combat Christian nationalism than Christian Zionism. Aren't they related? And why are they related?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just like scholars who write about Christian nationalism and avoid Christian Zionism, I would suggest that this is manifold. I think one is that Christian Zionism is in the water. So sometimes it's just there, ubiquitous, and people just assume, well, that's what it is. It's there. And so they don't pay attention to it, even though it's so critical to do so. And the other reason is because they're afraid to be called anti-Semitic. So scholars and others want to say all these things about Christian nationalism and its ties to whiteness. Its ties to the idea that the US is exceptional, which is, when people talk about the supposed founding of the country, which I do not promote that idea or believe in that, right? Country was built on the genocide of the indigenous people, but those early Puritans, those settlers came, committed genocide, displaced the indigenous people, believed that they were chosen by God to start a Christian nation, right? And they believed that this was a specially chosen nation. And that idea is very much alive in Christian nationalism. So it is a pillar for Christian Zionism in the US, and it is a pillar for Christian nationalism, right? To believe that the US is exceptional and chosen by God. You cannot separate those two. And scholars and others want to separate it because they don't want to touch Christian Zionism because they don't want to be called anti-Semitic. And people need to not be afraid to be called anti-Semitic because we need to name things for what they are. And we need to name the fact that Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic because it does not care about Jews because they are human beings. It uses them and treats them as objects. So those are things that have to be named specifically, and people need to make the connections because you cannot separate support for Israel from the Christian nationalist agenda. You cannot. But that's not even a scholarly move. It's observable by anyone who watches these movements and what they do and what they profess to care about, right? So I think it's a great observation. It's a great question, and we need to push people to not separate them or isolate them.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Such an important point to end this webinar on. So, reject both nationalism and Zionism, folks. Like they're not good for the soul. They're not good for the collective. And there's so many threads to pull from this conversation. There's so much to talk about. And so we are hoping to continue this conversation. Look out for another webinar coming soon. We're still in the midst of planning and organizing it. But there's a clear need to continue to talk and digest a lot about this conversation around Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism, theology, liberation theology. And we didn't even get to touch up on a little bit of what's currently happening on the right-wing sphere in this conversation, which is a whole thing. And so I want to thank each and every one of you of our panelists, Reverend Naomi, Reverend Crystal, Jonathan, for being a part of this conversation. I would love to thank all of you who joined on. I'm sure many of you didn't have work today, so it's great that we had folks join on an off day. I guess it's President's Day, but also there are some really important links in the chat that my colleague Alia posted. Some really great resources that she's posting now, as well as a donation link for Christians for a Free Palestine. They are a growing movement. We would appreciate the support in helping them continue to build their base and continue to think through campaigns and ways to organize Christian folks and folks of Christian lineage. So yeah, thank you all. Is there anything either of you would like to say before we end? We have 2 minutes.
I just want to quickly jump in here and say there's lots of great questions in the Q&A about, okay, so how do we undo this? How do we get people to walk away from this? How do we get people to withdraw their support for it, right? And there's been an acknowledgement also by somebody in the chat that this theology doesn't quite make sense. How does that work, right? What I've been trying to say to Christian folk, and I'll say this to everybody here, the reason is only going to get us so far. Logic and reason. Because people make decisions every day that defy logic and reason. If they are compelled otherwise by fear, right? By a deep desire to belong, right? Saying Free Palestine has meant for many Christians an eradication of ties of belonging. And so I don't want to cape for violent, despicable theology. I will say that it is the slow work, right, of getting to the emotional bottom of things. What are you afraid of? Right? What will this mean for you? How will this cost you? Let's walk through that, right? Because even when it makes sense in people's minds, their bodies may behave differently for other reasons, right? So this is why I think CFP and other organizations' work is so important, because we're getting at the rational, but we're also getting at the spiritual and emotional, right? That's what keeps people frozen in places that are no longer serving them. Yeah. So I just want to say that.
I appreciate it. And we'll end there. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Reverend Naomi. Thank you, Jonathan. Bye.